Hello, happy Tuesday, back to another fun day of things. All right, so this week we are talking about effective strategies to learn stuff by reading, which is really, really hard to do. So yesterday we talked about the starting point, which is creating your plan for learning, where the first thing you do is make sure you know what the goals for the learning process are. What is it you're trying to actually get out of the reading? And then to scan through the reading, notice the important points, and make yourself an outline to begin with. So if you have all of those done, then you should be pretty much set to essentially start reading and figure out what you need to do. So next thing, you want to make a plan to be able to read this in sections of some kind, and typically sections that make sense. So this is pretty focused on technical reading. Usually you will find sections literally layered out in under headings or something like that, a certain number of pages, but look at it and make sure it's an amount that you think you can digest in, honestly, a fairly short period of time. You don't actually want to be consistently reading, I don't think, for much more than 10 or 15 minutes, but definitely not more than 20 at a time. So depending on your pace of reading and your pace of sort of keeping track of stuff, choose sections that are going to fit into that shorter gap. In all honesty, I say make the sections shorter than longer, because the goal here is typically some kind of memory or being able to follow the concepts and stuff like that. So it is important to have smaller segments so you can keep track of those things. So now for each segment, you're going to follow a fairly sort of similar methodology for reading that works for you. First of all, you want to keep your outline handy. You should always read with pen in hand, as I like to say, although sometimes I read with computer or iPad in hand. I mean, same concept when you're at this level. So have that next to me so that I am ready to use it as needed. Read in a manner so that you make sure you read the words. Now, this is going to be different for different people. I am much more of an eye scanner, and I move fairly quickly through it. Now, that's important, but also I have to be careful not to overscan things. If you are a person who needs to follow it along, follow it along. If it helps you take a pen and follow it along, take a pen and follow it along. Whatever you need to do to read these sections effectively. Here is the one thing that I don't think you should do. Don't do it with a highlighter, and also don't highlight your text. It is, without question, the worst method of trying to remember things for a couple of reasons. One, it doesn't actually do anything to help you remember. It just colors something. But two, and this is the worst part, it makes you think you've learned something when possibly you haven't. Your brain really likes to trick you. It likes to be like, oh yeah, I recognize that. I colored that in orange. I definitely know what that is. No, you definitely don't know what that is, and your brain is not going to understand it unless you're very careful about it. So I am pretty much entirely against highlighting. There are studies out there that I could get my hands on that make it clear that highlighting is a bad idea. Don't do it. Don't underline things either. Don't do any of that kind of stuff. The only thing that would be acceptable in terms of writing on the page would be literally writing on the page. That would be like taking a side note of some kind. And if you're going to take a side note of some kind on a page, maybe you just put that in your outline. Or if you're going to do it, come back and transfer it to your outline, but make sure your outline is somewhere separate from the book so it is more condensed and easier to follow. As you go, so this is what you should be doing, since you should not be highlighting, put things in your outline. You can do that as sort of clustered as you think you need to. For me, sometimes I will read a couple of paragraphs and then go back and put stuff down. If you're trying to get definitions, you might, and there's a lot in a paragraph, you might read one paragraph, then get those definitions down, or go through a segment and then go back and write some stuff down. But this is where you put key concepts. Your outline should not be sentences. Not at all. The book is sentences. The text is sentences. Your outline should be pieces, fragments, segments, not sentences, even definitions, not sentences. You want it to be the shortest amount of stuff you need to really effectively understand it. And I think that's important. You should also find ways to make notes for things that you think are important for some reason or another. Hey, this is a key concept, put a star next to it. Also, a way to make notes about what you're thinking while you're reading, because that's another really good thing to do, is that if you read a paragraph and then you think, I'd like to do this with this, or this reminds me of that. Find a way to denote a thought you're having associated with the material. So when I did notes, I very often did little sort of curvy arrows for bullets. So this is the next point, and this is the next point. But if I had a thought, I would put a star and be like, well, that's my thought that goes along with it. And that's useful as well. So definitely write stuff down as you go within the segment. And when you finish a segment, you should then have a written record of it, whether you did it a paragraph at a time or whether you went through the whole segment, went back and wrote a whole bunch of stuff down. Either way can work depending on what you're doing. Also, if you do note those key concepts, put the page numbers with them in the outline. It's a really key because especially if one of your goals is to use this book as a reference for any reason, you want to be able to actually reference those pieces and pages. That's super important. So then you have the page numbers in the right spots. One of the things that this can lead to is if you actually have true open book exams that you'll eventually be taking and stuff like that, you can put tabs, like little sticky tabs in the book that back relate to your notes. So if your note has a word, you can then go right to that sticky tab in the book and be able to answer a question much more quickly. So again, this is partially goal dependent. What are you trying to accomplish? Make sure your outline includes what you're trying to accomplish. If what you're trying to accomplish is to learn how to solve a math problem, somewhere in your outline should probably be the steps to solving a math problem. If it includes definitions, your outline should have definitions. If it's broad concepts, then your outline should have notes to those broad concepts and things to remind you of them. If your stuff is very image heavy, your outline should reference the images and note where they are in the book so that it'll go with it, or even make your own sketch version of something to simplify to remind you of what the real one looks like. That's all stuff that goes in your outline. So as you read each section, so if you read for 10 or 15 or 20 minutes, that's not all reading. Some of that is writing. So maybe you're reading for 10 minutes and half of it is you read and then you write some stuff down. You read and then you write some stuff down. This is how you're going to follow and learn it. And just pick the shortest possible thing that you can keep track of. If it's a paragraph, it's a paragraph. If it's 2 sentences, then you got to summarize it in 2 bullet points. 2 sentences, you summarize it in 2 bullet points. This is how you get through it. You keep making stuff in your outline, you'll get to that reading. All right, tomorrow, we talk about taking the stuff in that outline and actually putting it in the right spots in your brain. Right now, today, we just put the reading on another piece of paper or in a digital format. It's an easier to follow one, but it's another format. It's not actually in your brain yet. Right now, it's only gone from your eyes to the page. That's an important distinction. So tomorrow, we get it into the brain. All right, so that is my effective reading stuff for today. I will update the Google Doc that I'm working on for that and then link it in here. I have to give that to somebody at some point because it's going to be fun. All right, so that means we are on to today's COVID research article. Today, we're going to discuss a little bit about what makes an article, especially a brand new preprint article, worth listening to or worth waiting on. So I went to my Lit COVID today and I found pretty much a great title to an article. It says Profile of RT-PCR for SARS-CoV, preliminary study from 56 COVID-19 patients. It's not a lot of patients, but that's what preliminary study means. And it notes in the very tiny abstract, they studied the dynamics profile, and then it says, we found virus shedding was up to 6 weeks after onset of symptoms. Prolonged observation period is necessary for older patients. All right, so here's what happens with that. The media gets that and goes, oh man, people can pass the coronavirus for 6 weeks. First of all, that is not what that sentence said. But second of all, nobody should be saying that without examining the data themselves in some manner, or at least having your science person, which is me, examine the data. So I pulled up their paper. It is a 100% preprint. It is actually still in like double-spaced PDF formatting. And let me tell you, I recognize all this stuff from when I used to put things together. You have your little abstract and your keywords. And I'm actually surprised it doesn't have line numbers, but I suppose that's for us. But that's what you do when you hand in a draft. It has line numbers and everything. It's crazy. All right. So it talks about the infectious disease. It talks about the methods and that they were examining 56 hospitalized patients with confirmed infection. So these are people who tested positive using real-time PCR. Now, real-time PCR has a lot of false negatives, but if they tested positive, they pretty much have it because it doesn't pick up a lot of other stuff. So, did these patients definitely have COVID-19? Yes. The other note they make about them is that they were not ICU patients. So these are mild to moderate. So they were in a hospital, but not in an ICU bed, not on a ventilator. So it's a particular group of people. Now, it's an important group of people because it's the people who live and go on in most cases. So, but you should know what you're looking at. Let's see, they were looking at the RT-PCR results, and they say that they were tested somewhat regularly, although let me tell you, one of the things I was having trouble finding was exactly how often they were testing. So nowhere in the methods does it tell me how many days were in between tests. Were they testing every day, every some number of hours, every couple of days? I have no idea. So one of the notes they make, and this is a pretty common thing with RT-PCR, is that if 2 consecutive negative results were achieved, they would define that as, that's it. Nucleic acid conversion time, everything from that point is the thing. Okay, this is a lot of different possibilities because, again, we know this test can have a pretty high negative rate. So if you're testing every day and you get 2 negatives in a row, there's still a pretty high probability that you're either missing it in some manner or whatever. And they do say later in the paper that multiple times, so 4, I think, out of the 56, they tested 2 negatives in a row and then kept testing and got more positives. So this is important because people are still using this as a method to say, oh, you've recovered, and we know this is a problem for multiple reasons. One of them is the false negative rate, but the second one is that later on in the disease, when the virus is really embedded in the lungs, the nasal pharyngeal swabs and throat swabs don't always pick it up in high enough amounts, and it kind of shifts up and down. So 2 negatives in a row really may or may not be useful depending on how many days. This article doesn't give me that. So I have some issues with it already because I don't know how often they sampled. So I want to know how often they sampled. All right, so then they talk about the results, and they're all patients who were discharged. They don't say when. They were slightly more men than women, which has been pretty consistent in a lot of this stuff. So go women. We still don't know why, but that's kind of a neat thing. And then it has detailed demographic characteristics shown in Supplemental Table 1. Guess what's not in this article? Supplemental Table 1, which is going to be something that I'm going to be annoyed at a whole bunch of times in this article because it's a little hard to find. So I can get the supplemental data, but I have to download it completely separately. Oh, so if you were just reading this article and you weren't going to hunt for the supplemental data, you wouldn't have it. All right, so now I can actually look at the supplemental data. It's in huge tables because that's kind of the way it is. And they do talk about the RT-PCR tests and test days after onset, so characteristics and demographics of all of their patients. Let me see. And it gives all the numbers of the days after onset that they were still testing for. So there are a lot of numbers in this particular one. All right, now I'm going to check out supplemental data 2. Supplemental data 2 lumps things into weeks. So RT-PCR test per week per patient, notes if they were positive or negative, and this table just lumps the data together, so that's not the most useful. And then I've got one more supplemental table to enjoy, and this one is the demographic and clinical characteristics, which they do actually talk a little bit about. So, all right, let me go back to the data. All right, so it does look, based on these numbers, like they might have been testing on a daily basis because they have test days after onset. So that still tells me, though, that 2 negatives in a row is the wrong number to use to then get it back again. So I definitely have some issues with that. Also, this supplemental table has multiple RT-PCRs and not a whole lot of other useful stuff. I'll definitely link to the original on this so you can see it. Okay, let's go back to the paper. All right. It says all results were negative in week 6 after onset. Okay, so after week 6, everything was negative. That's good. And that's for everybody. It says that the average, let's see, the positive rate was highest at week 1, followed by numbers that decrease as you would, imagine. So let's see, more than half were done by week 3, more than 2/3 by week 4, and so on. Then it notes that they divided the patients into what they would call prolonged and non-prolonged shedding groups. So 24 days was their stopping point, which I suppose makes sense. That's the number we've seen before, is about 3 weeks or so of symptoms and of virus. And then they note that the people in the group that had longer viral RNA detected, they call this viral shedding. And that is a useful virology term, but not a useful human term, because it doesn't actually mean that we know that there are active virus particles doing something specific. We know from this assay that there was detectable real-time PCR data, meaning RNA. It's also hard to tell how much of it there is. So this is a very difficult thing when we say viral shedding. We have no idea if that means these people could get anyone sick. None at all. Those two things are not at all related. Viral shedding in an RNA study does not mean can pass the virus on, plus or minus. We have no idea. So just be aware of that. All right, so then let's see. Notes about the similarities to other things in the discussion, which is what you're supposed to do, is back relate to stuff. It showed that the 56 recovered patients, that the majority of them got positive results within 3 weeks and then began being negative from week 4 on, which is, again, what we see. So that is not new or different data, and that the positive tests kept declining. So let me look at the actual table 2 data, in which at week 5 there were, let's see, 7 positive results and 51 negative results for the N of 56, which is a little funky. Yeah, most of these some of them add up and some of them don't. I'm really interested in tables in which the N is 56 and the number of tests does not add up to 56 each week. But it might be related to the number of tests they did, because it says test per week per patient. So again, this data is very hard to follow and very hard to have anything understandable. I'll try to examine the table that has the actual singular data in it. So it looks like from this data that they actually did 7 different PCR tests, and that 2 of them were supposed to be control negatives. So you check their methods here. So they were detected using nucleic acid detection kit, looking at 2 target genes, open reading frame, and nucleic acid protein. So I also don't know a lot about what PCR they actually did. If I was a virologist, I would want to know all the sequences and all of that stuff. And I also don't see that here. So this is still not super helpful data. And so then if I start looking for the test days after onset in a general sense, most of the numbers are actually low. Most of them are below 21, except for the RT-PCR 4. And then there's a whole bunch of not applicables. And in general, this data is super difficult to follow. Okay. So it looks like they're listed in days after onset. Now I'm starting to get how this table is put together, which is super annoying. They didn't test everybody equally. So in some cases, they tested them one day after onset. In some cases, they didn't get to them until 11 or 15 days after onset. So we don't know what their numbers were early on. And then in the days after onset, they were able to get the negative and positive results. So tested positive at 3 days after onset, negative at 16, negative at 18, and positive at 19. So remember that positive, negative problem, that would happen there. And I could see that because those days are very tight together. But then they tested negative again at 24 and at 26. So I can definitely see where some of this information comes in. So where's the longest out positive number? Because they said they had one that was 6 weeks. So where's the positive test? There's a positive over here by 16. There's a positive by 23. There's a positive by 25. What does that work out to be? 25 divided by 7. Still not that far. So where's the positive that I'm actually looking for? 26, 27. Oh, here's 31. So 31 is 5 weeks after. So we're still not quite at 6. So, there seems to be not a whole lot of this. So if the news comes out and says it can shed for up to 6 weeks, I don't even see that in the data. I see 31, which takes you over 5 weeks. So I suppose that's how you get to 6 weeks. It was an 81-year-old patient who they didn't even start testing until day 20 after onset of symptoms, which also tells me that this patient had an extremely bad, was going to last an extremely long time, different kind of thing. So here's the real piece of data that I think is missing from this that I think is important. It only relates the PCR to onset of symptoms, not stopping of symptoms. I have no idea when these patients stopped having symptoms. That data is nowhere to be found. All of these patients could have had symptoms straight through the time that they had the PCR results. That's information that we need. So this is not what I would call a useful piece of data, except for one thing. There's one thing I like about this study, which is that it notes that 2 negative PCR tests in a row, especially when they are done close together, is not criteria for assuming somebody is over the virus, and other things probably need to be considered. For example, as I've pointed out with other papers in the past, CT scans, symptomatic stuff, things like that. So by the way, if the news comes out and says people are can give you this virus for 6 weeks after symptoms start, and you're just randomly worried about anybody who ever had a little bit of a fever and came back, that is not what this paper says. That is probably not true. All these people were in a hospital for a long period of time. It doesn't tell me how long. They were followed up afterwards. Most of them didn't have viral RNA after that, and we don't know how much viral RNA actually relates to how much somebody can get symptoms. So from a basic science perspective of here's some interesting questions to ask more research about, yes. From a useful science perspective of we can use this data to tell the public useful things, no. And that's a really important distinction. All right, I gotta go, office hours. Bye.